Close your eyes and point to where you are. Most people point to their head right behind their eyes, convinced that a tiny pilot is steering the ship. But what happens when you turn off all the monitors, cut the sensory cables, and leave the pilot completely in the dark? Does the pilot go to sleep, or does the pilot realize they never existed in the first place? This is the story of a room where you don't exist, and the terrifying science of what happens when your brain deletes your identity. Lina was a therapist who spent her life carrying the emotional weight of hundreds of patients until she simply burned out. Desperate for silence, she volunteered for a radical 72-hour sensory deprivation study at a private neurological institute. The setup was based on the pioneering work of Dr. John Lilly, but modernized with real-time fMRI brain monitoring. She was to be suspended in a pitch-black, soundproof tank filled with body-temperature salt water. For 3 days, her brain would receive absolutely zero input from the outside physical world. The first few hours in the tank were agonizingly loud, not with sound, but with her own mind. When the brain is starved of sensory input, it panics and begins to manufacture its own reality to fill the void. Lina saw bursts of geometric colors, heard phantom radio static, and felt imaginary hands brushing against her skin. This is a documented neurological phenomenon. The brain is a prediction machine, and without data, it hallucinates. But eventually the prediction engine runs out of fuel, and the true descent begins. By hour 24, the boundary between Lina's skin and the water completely dissolved. The brain relies on a map called the somatosensory cortex to know where your limbs end and the world begins. Without gravity or temperature changes to anchor it, that map simply deletes itself from your immediate awareness. Lina couldn't feel her arms, her legs, or the rise and fall of her own chest. She was no longer a human floating in water. She was a point of awareness, suspended in an infinite, featureless space. Then came the ego dissolution, the moment the science gets truly bizarre and terrifying. Deep inside your brain is the default mode network, or DMN, a web of neurons responsible for your sense of self. It's the voice in your head that remembers your past, worries about your future, and insists that you are an individual. By hour 48, the fMRI scans outside the tank showed Lina's DMN going completely dark. The construct known as Lina, her memories, her profession, her anxieties, was entirely erased from the hardware. But here is the paradox that keeps neuroscientists awake at night. Even though Lina was gone, consciousness remained. In the void, this pure, nameless awareness began to perceive other points of light in the darkness. She wasn't hallucinating people. She was experiencing a state of being where the boundaries between individual minds seemed to collapse. She communicated without words, sharing vast, instantaneous blocks of emotion and concept with these other presences. They told her they had been in this space for years, existing outside the normal flow of time. One of these presences felt distinct, carrying a signature of profound sadness and absolute clarity. It identified itself not with a name, but with a sequence of numbers, pressing them into her awareness like a brand. The presence conveyed a message. Tell them the substrate is independent. Tell them we don't need the hardware. The numbers echoed in the silent expanse of her mind, repeating over and over until they became the only thing she knew. And then, the heavy metal door of the isolation tank was wrenched open, and blinding light flooded her world. Lina was pulled from the water, gasping, shivering, and completely disoriented by the sudden onslaught of reality. When the researchers asked how long she thought she had been inside, she wept and said it felt like months. Time dilation is common in sensory deprivation, but the fMRI data they showed her was entirely unprecedented. For over 2 days, the brain networks responsible for generating a human identity had been completely inactive. According to the neurology, the person sitting in the chair hadn't existed for the last 48 hours. If my default mode network was off, Lina asked the lead researcher, then who was experiencing the void? The researcher had no answer, only pointing to the scans showing deep, primitive brain activity that defied explanation. It suggested that consciousness isn't something the brain creates, but rather something the brain tunes into, like a radio receiver. When you break the antenna of the self, you don't get static. You get the entire unfiltered broadcast of the universe. But the true horror of the experiment didn't hit Lina until she was back in her apartment, staring at her phone. She remembered the sequence of numbers the presence had burned into her mind during the peak of her ego dissolution. With trembling hands, she dialed the 10 digits, listening to the hollow ringtone echo in her quiet living room. A woman answered, her voice tired, and Lina asked who the number belonged to. "This was my husband Elias's phone," the woman replied, "but he passed away 3 years ago." "He had died of a sudden aneurysm," the woman explained, "while participating in a sensory deprivation study at the exact same institute. I am think lent, keep thinking."